Welcome to the deep dive. This week has felt like just a flood of information, right?
Absolutely. So much happening.
Boycotts, student loans, civil rights stuff, energy policy, even that Real ID deadline finally creeping up. It's uh, it's a lot to track.
It really is. Hard to keep it all straight.
Well, that's what we're here for. We've been looking at the top stories from this week's Observer Group newspapers of Southern California, the April 30th, 2025 edition.
Right. And we're going to try and, cut through some of that noise.
Exactly. Our goal here is to give you a clear picture of what's developing, why it actually matters, but, without just drowning you in details.
Think of it as your briefing on the key stuff.
Consider it your shortcut to being properly informed this week.
So where should we start? There's a lot to unpack.
Okay, let's kick off with something that's generating a lot of buzz. That ongoing national boycott of Target. It seems Reverend Jamal Bryant is really pushing this.
Yeah, and it's important to remember the context why it began. It wasn't out of the blue.
It was about those DEI programs, right?
Exactly. Target stopped those initiatives. The diversity, equity, and inclusion ones they'd started after George Floyd's death in 2020. That's the root of it.
And Reverend Bryant's been highlighting the financial consequences for Target.
Consequences is one word for it. The numbers are pretty striking.
Yeah, I saw an estimate of a $12 billion loss. I mean, think about that figure. $12 billion.
It's massive, and their stock price reflects that too. Dropped from around $138 down to $94.
Wow. And foot traffic.
Down almost 8%, nearly 7.9%, I think. These aren't small dips.
No, definitely not. Those kinds of figures, well, they make any corporation sit up and take notice, surely.
Yeah.
It says something about consumer power today.
And the boycott isn't just a general protest. It has very specific aims. Reverend Bryant laid out 4 key demands.
Okay, what are those?
Well, first, a $2 billion pledge to Black businesses. Target has apparently met that one, at least partially.
Partially, okay. What else?
A $250 million deposit in Black-owned banks. That hasn't happened. Then, reinstatement of those DEI programs we mentioned.
Also not met.
Not met. And finally, funding for community pipeline centers at 10 HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. Also not met.
So really, only partial movement on one point. The core demands around DEI and specific investments seem to be sticking points.
Precisely. And this is where it gets interesting regarding the role of the Black press.
How so?
Well, Reverend Bryant and also Dr. Benjamin F. Chavez Jr., he's the president of the NNPA, the National Newspaper Publishers Association.
Right, the Black Press Association.
Yes. They're really insisting that Target needs to acknowledge and actually invest in Black-owned media as part of this. They see the Black press as, well, essential.
That's a powerful stance, especially when you think about the history. The Black press isn't new. It goes back, nearly 200 years?
All the way back to 1827, Freedom's Journal. It's always been, as they say, agents of social change, defenders of shared values.
You think of people like Ida B. Wells exposing lynchings during Reconstruction and Jim Crow. Right. The Black press was crucial then.
Absolutely crucial. It provided narratives you just wouldn't find elsewhere, countering negative stereotypes in the mainstream, and that job continues.
Cheryl Smith from Texas Metro News put it well, didn't she? Something about its significance in every era.
Yeah, she said, if we look back at every period in our lives since its inception, we can see how significant the Black press was. And Dr. Chavez argues that even now, in 2025, the accurate telling of this story, this narrative, really only happens through the Black press.
He said something like they're the only media institutions that have always stood with the community.
Always stood with us are our own, I think was the quote. And the NNPA represents over 200 Black-owned papers, so it's a significant voice.
So for you listening, this story really brings home 2 things. The potential power of focused economic action and the enduring importance of independent media, like the Black press, in framing issues and fighting for communities.
It's a really potent combination.
Okay, let's shift gears now. Completely different topic, but one that also hits people's finances hard. Student loan debt. Looks like the Trump administration is moving forward on collecting delinquent payments.
Yes, that's a big one. The Department of Education is gearing up to collect on overdue federal student loans.
Who are they targeting specifically?
It's aimed at about 5.3 million people who are at least a year behind on their payments. And you have to remember the scale here. The total federal student loan portfolio is huge.
How much are we talking?
Nearly $1.6 trillion. So from the administration's perspective, this overdue portion is a significant issue, for taxpayers.
And the collection methods sound pretty serious. starting May 5th.
That's the date, yes.
Yep.
And the methods include potentially withholding tax refunds, taking Social Security benefits, garnishing wages for federal employees, even holding back federal pensions.
Wow, okay. That's quite direct.
It is. Now, it's important to see this in context. This comes after the end of that long grace period on repayments initiated by the Biden administration.
Right, that started during the pandemic.
Yeah, initially it was 12 months, but it kept getting extended, ended up being 3 years. That ended back on September 30th, 2024. The current administration is basically saying, time's up, we can't extend it further.
I saw Dr. Walter M. Kimbrough had some interesting thoughts on this, connecting it to wider issues.
He did. Dr. Kimbrough links this delinquency problem to broader income inequality and specifically the historical wealth gap for Black Americans.
How does he make that connection?
He points back to things like Black GIs often being denied the benefits of the GI Bill after World War II.
Right, which massively impacted wealth building for that generation.
Exactly. His argument is that these historical injustices create disadvantages that compound over time, affecting things like the ability to pay for college or pay back loans. So he says you can't really talk about loan repayment fairly without acknowledging that whole systemic backdrop.
It definitely adds a layer of complexity. It's not just about individual choices.
Not at all. And think about how long this debt follows people. The average borrower takes 20 years to pay it off.
20 years. Wow.
And some professionals, like doctors or lawyers, can take over 45 years. Even the Obamas, they didn't pay off their student loans until they were in their 40s, around 2005.
So when you hear about delinquency, it's tied into these really long-term burdens and complex economic factors, something for you, the listener, to keep in mind.
It raises fundamental questions about higher education access cost and its role in, economic mobility.
Definitely. Okay, let's move on. We're seeing civil rights groups banding together now. They've announced something called the Pact.
Yes, the Pact, a civil rights coalition unity commitment. This is coming from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights.
And they have quite a history, right? Involved in major civil rights legislation for decades.
75 years, yeah. They've been instrumental in getting pretty much every major federal civil rights law passed in the U.S., so when they speak, it carries weight.
And what prompted this pact now?
They're citing what they describe as escalating threats and retaliatory actions coming from the White House and federal agencies. They feel these groups, these advocacy organizations, are being targeted.
Targeted how? What kind of actions are they concerned about?
They talk about the government systems being sort of weaponized to suppress justice work, things like terminating grants unexpectedly, politically motivated investigations, threats to their tax-exempt status, which is crucial for nonprofits, and even actions that create a chilling effect on lawyers offering pro bono free legal help.
So they feel their fundamental ability to operate and advocate is being threatened.
That seems to be the core concern. They see it as part of a broader effort to maybe dismantle public services, get rid of oversight, and undermine these nonprofit groups.
And what does the pact actually commit them to do?
It's essentially a mutual defense agreement. Signatories pledge to support each other if one is, quote, unjustly targeted. They'll share information and resources. They also commit to refusing to censor their own missions due to political pressure and just continuing their advocacy work.
And who's involved in this? Is it a narrow group?
No, it's actually quite broad. It includes organizations representing a wide range of racial, ethnic, religious, and identity groups. You've got the ACLU, the National Urban League, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, lots of prominent names.
So a diverse coalition, what are their shared values here?
The pact outlines support for basic rights and services, things like healthcare, education, fair legal representation, clean environment, voting rights, protection from discrimination, pretty fundamental stuff.
And language they're using is quite strong.
Very strong. Quotes like, "We will not be silent, divided, or stop serving the public or allow the people we serve to be harmed, and we will not be intimidated into silence or abandoning our communities."
It definitely signals resolve. So for you listening, this story really underscores the idea of collective action being vital for protecting rights and the key role these advocacy groups play.
And it makes you wonder about the resilience of civil society when it feels pressured by government.
Good point. Okay, let's switch gears again, this time to California and a pretty intense debate over energy policy. This might be something you felt at the pump recently.
Yes, the California energy debate. It's definitely heating up. You've got mineral owners, investors, some policymakers, all quite critical of the state's current direction.
What's their main complaint? Overregulation.
That's a big part of it, yeah. They argue California's policies create an unconducive economic climate. Too many regulations, they say, hurt earnings, make it tough to do business.
And ultimately, they argue those costs get passed on.
Right, passed on to consumers, like higher gas prices.
Are there concrete examples of this impact?
Yeah.
Companies leaving or closing?
There are. Valero is talking about closing its refinery in Benicia. That's a big deal. It would cut the state's gasoline production capacity by about 9%, potentially costing over 400 jobs.
Wow. Any others?
Chevron announced plans to move its headquarters out to Texas. And Phillips 66 is set to close its LA area refinery by the end of this year, 2025.
Those are significant moves. Have politicians weighed in?
Oh, yes. Assembly Minority Leader James Gallagher has been very critical of Governor Newsom, accusing him of waging a war on California energy producers.
And he points to specific laws.
He cites recent anti-price gouging laws, SB X12 and AB X21, claiming they're contributing to California having much higher gas prices than the rest of the country.
How much higher?
About $1.70 higher than the national average, based on recent reports.
Ouch. What's the governor's response? Is he concerned about these companies leaving?
He seems to be. He wrote a letter to the California Energy Commission asking them to intervene and basically ensure oil producers don't leave, stressing collaboration and, the fact that California still needs gasoline.
So, political maneuvering, but it's also ended up in court, right?
That's right. There's a lawsuit specifically challenging Senate Bill 1137.
Remind me, what does SB 1137 do?
It creates a 200-foot setback, basically a buffer zone around sensitive sites like homes, schools, hospitals, where new oil drilling and even maintenance on existing wells is banned.
And who's suing?
Mineral owners, specifically Monty Beard Sr. and Mary Vanderwall, are named plaintiffs. They argue the law is unconstitutional.
On what grounds?
They claim it threatens their livelihoods, reduces their property values, and will force California to rely more on foreign oil, which might have, worse environmental or labor practices.
It sounds like for some, like Mr. Beard, this is very personal. His family has owned rights for a long time.
Since 1929. He mentioned the royalties helped pay for his kids' college. So yeah, it directly impacts family finances and legacy. It really grounds the policy debate in human terms.
Absolutely. But what was the original motivation for SB 1137? Environmental concerns.
Primarily, yes. Environmental groups pushed for it hard. The goal is to phase out fossil fuels eventually and protect residents, especially in communities near oil fields, from pollutants.
Like the Inglewood oil field near black communities in LA.
That's often cited as an example, yes. They're concerned about health impacts from things like volatile organic compounds, particulate matter associated with drilling near homes.
But the lawsuit claims the setback distance is arbitrary.
They argue the 3,200 feet isn't based on solid science. So it's a clash between protecting health and phasing out fossil fuels versus property rights and economic impacts.
And there's the issue of old wells, too, right? Lots of unplugged ones near populated areas.
California has many unplugged wells, yeah.
Yeah.
That adds another layer to the safety and environmental concerns.
So for you listening, this is a really clear example of that tough balancing act. Environment versus economy, state policy versus individual impact, and how it all plays out in things like the price of gas.
A really complex issue with no easy answers, shaping California's energy future.
Okay, one last thing for today, and this one might affect your travel plans soon. Real ID. That deadline is finally almost here. It feels like we've been talking about this forever.
It does feel that way. But yes, May 7th, 2025. That's the date federal enforcement starts at U.S. airports and some federal buildings.
Meaning you'll need what exactly for domestic flights?
You'll need a driver's license or state ID that is Real ID compliant, or another acceptable ID, like a U.S. passport.
And how are Californians doing on getting this done? Are most people compliant?
Not quite. The latest figures show just over 55% have a Real ID. That's about 18 million people, but still leaves a large chunk who don't.
So if you're in that other 45%, what do you need to do?
You need to make a DMV appointment, fill out the application online first to get a code, and bring your documents. There's a $35 fee as well.
And this all stems from way back post 9/11 security measures.
Correct. The Real ID Act itself was passed in 2005. The goal was to create more secure, standardized state IDs for federal purposes.
The former TSA head, Pekosk, emphasized its importance for security.
Yeah, David Pekoski called identity verification foundational to security and urged people to get compliant.
Even though the deadline's been pushed back so many times, it was originally meant to be 2008.
Something like that, yes. Multiple postponements over the years. But this time, it seems to be sticking.
How can you tell if your California license is Real ID compliant?
Look for the little golden bear symbol in the upper right corner. If it has that, you're good for domestic flights.
Okay, domestic flights for adults 18 and over. Not usually needed for international travel, though.
Generally, no. You'll need your passport for international flights. Real ID can sometimes be used for land or sea crossings to Mexico or Canada, but passports are standard for air travel.
And what documents do you need to get the real ID? Proof of identity.
One, proof of identity, like a valid passport, certified birth certificate, that sort of thing.
And proof of residency.
Two proofs of California residency. Things like utility bills, cell phone bills, bank statements are preferred. Needs your current address.
What happens if you show up at the airport after May 7th without a real ID or passport?
Well, the TSA is saying you could face delays, definitely expect extra screening, and potentially you could even be denied entry through the security checkpoint altogether.
So you might miss your flight.
It's a real possibility. Their advice is if you don't have real ID or an alternative like a passport, get to the airport really early.
How are
At least 3 hours before your domestic flight.
3 hours for domestic? Okay. So for you listening, this is very practical stuff. Check your ID. Figure out if you need to visit the DMV before any travel after May 7th next year. It could save a lot of hassle.
Definitely worth checking now, rather than finding out at the airport security line. It raises that ongoing question of balancing security needs with traveler convenience.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've really covered some ground, haven't we?
We definitely have. From the Target boycott and its economic ripple effects to student loan collections.
The civil rights groups forming the pact, those intense California energy debates.
And finally, the looming Real ID deadline. It really shows how these local stories and national policies are all, interconnected.
Yeah, you see these threads running through economic pressures, the fight for civil rights and fairness, big policy clashes with real-world impacts, and just evolving rules we all have to adapt to.
Recurring themes for sure.
We really hope this discussion has given you a bit more depth than just, skimming the headlines. A better sense of the issues, who's involved, what might happen next.
Hopefully a clearer picture of why these things matter.
And maybe a final thought for you to chew on. We saw a lot this week about collective action.
Right, whether it's consumers boycotting, advocacy groups uniting, or even just millions of people needing to get the same ID.
So maybe reflect on which of these stories hit closest to home for you and why. Perhaps it sparks an interest to look more into some of the groups or policies we talked about today.
Food for thought, definitely. How does collective action play out in different spheres, and what's its real power?